My name is Reese. I'm 34, and I am the majority shareholder and acting CEO of a regional logistics and supply chain company that operates across 6 states and employs 340 people. I did not inherit it. I did not marry into it. I built my position in it over 9 years through a combination of financial discipline, strategic patience, and the particular kind of clarity that arrives when the people who were supposed to believe in you make it permanently clear that they don't. I know what a capitalization table looks like. I know what a silent equity stake means in a board meeting. I know the difference between the person whose name is on the letterhead and the person whose signature actually moves the company. And I know, down to the org chart, exactly what it looks like when the people who called you a poor failure at a holiday dinner are now 3 reporting levels below the person they said that to. My family disowned me on a Tuesday evening in December 7 years ago at my Aunt Patricia's house over a dinner that had been going wrong for about an hour before it went irrevocable. My cousin Marcus said it first. He said, "No offense, but you're always going to be the one who couldn't figure it out." My Uncle Dale said something about knowing when to cut losses. My aunt smiled the way she smiled when she agreed with something and wanted credit for being above the conversation. My mother, who was there, said nothing. That was its own answer. I drove home in a 2014 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on for 6 weeks, and that I had been managing with a can of fuel injector cleaner and a working knowledge of which warning lights were urgent and which ones were the car's way of asking for attention it wasn't going to get right now. I did not cry on that drive. I did what I had learned to do with information that hurt. I filed it. I let it settle into the category of things that are true and cannot be unfacted, and that therefore needed to be built around rather than argued with. They thought I was a poor failure. That was real. That was what they believed. What they did not know was what I was building. And what I had already decided, somewhere on that drive home, with the check engine light glowing orange in the dark, was that I was going to build it in silence until the silence ended on my terms. Welcome to the Family Ledger, where we talk honestly about money, family, and the moments when the people who counted you out have to reckon with what you built while they weren't watching. If you've ever been dismissed by the people who should have believed in you first, this story is for you. Subscribe, drop a comment, and let me take you back to where this started. I want to tell you about the family first, because you need to understand the ecosystem before you can understand why leaving it was both the hardest thing I had done and the most necessary. My mother's side of the family, the side that matters to this story, is a specific kind of Southern middle-class family that has organized its entire social structure around the performance of stability. Not actual stability, which is a different thing, the performance of it. The right neighborhood, the right cars, the right jobs with the right titles, the holiday dinners where everyone arrives in pressed clothes and talks about their accomplishments in the careful way that is not bragging because it is family. My Uncle Dale owned a chain of auto parts stores across 3 counties. Not a large operation, but a visible one. The kind of business that generates a certain local reputation and a certain amount of money and a considerable amount of self-regard. He had employed my cousin Marcus since Marcus was 22, first in the stores and then in what Dale called corporate, which was a 3-person office above the main store in Greensboro. My Aunt Patricia was Dale's wife. She was the family's social architect, the one who organized the gatherings and set the tone for them, the one whose approval or disapproval circulated through the extended family like weather. She had opinions about everyone's choices that she delivered with the warmth of someone offering helpful observations rather than the judgment they actually were. My mother, Sandra, was Patricia's younger sister. She worked as an administrative coordinator at a medical practice and had spent most of my childhood in the mild gravitational pull of her older sister's orbit, agreeing with Patricia's assessments of things and people, including me, with the gentle consistency of someone who had decided that keeping the peace was worth the cost of what she was keeping it at. My father had left when I was 11. Not dramatically. He simply redirected his life toward a different city and a different family and maintained contact through Christmas cards for 4 years and then did not maintain it. I do not carry significant feeling about this. He was not a large presence when he was there, and his absence recalibrated to normal faster than I expected. I grew up understanding that in this family, worth was measured in visible outcomes: salary, title, address, the car in the driveway, the vacation you mentioned at dinner, the job description you could deliver, and a sentence that made the room nod. These were the currencies of belonging, and I had, by the time I was 27 and sitting at Patricia's dinner table in December, none of them in denominations the family recognized. What I had at 27 was this: a bachelor's degree in supply chain management from a state university that the family had never regarded as particularly impressive. A job as an operations coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company called Meridian Supply Group, which paid $52,000 a year and which the family understood to mean I worked in shipping, which they understood to mean I had not figured it out. A studio apartment I shared with exactly no one. A savings rate of 34% of my take-home income, which I had maintained for 3 years and which I had told no one about. Because in this family, the accumulation was not respectable until it became visible, and it was not yet visible. And I had been studying. Every evening, on my secondhand couch, with library books and online courses, and the particular obsessive focus of someone who understands that the gap between where they are and where they intend to be is bridged only by information and time, and they can control one of those variables completely. I was studying supply chain finance, logistics company valuation, equity acquisition, how private companies and fragmented industries got consolidated by strategic buyers, how minority stakes became majority stakes, how a person with the right knowledge, the right relationships, and the right patience could enter a company at one level and exit at a completely different one. I was not yet doing any of that. I was learning it, the same way you learn a language before you travel to the country. The December dinner was the third one, where Marcus had said something that crossed from the general family dismissiveness I had learned to navigate into something I could not file away without it changing something. The first had been 2 years earlier. He had asked, in front of the table, what exactly I did at work. With the specific emphasis on exactly that signaled he expected the answer to be less than it sounded. I explained my role. He nodded in the way that means he had already moved on internally. He said, so basically logistics admin. I said operations coordination. He said, right. The second had been the previous Christmas. He had announced that he had been made vice president of Dale's company. Dale had looked at the table with the pride of a man watching his succession plan take shape. Patricia had made a sound of warm approval. Marcus had said, vice president at 28, not bad, right? And looked at me specifically when he said it, with the particular smile of someone who is measuring the distance between you. I had said, congratulations. I meant it without bitterness. He had a VP title at his father's 3-county auto parts operation. That was what it was. The third dinner was December of the year I was 27. And the dinner had been going wrong for an hour. The way family dinners go wrong when there is a current running underneath the surface conversation that everyone can feel and nobody is naming. The current was money. Dale's stores had had a difficult year. The national auto parts chains had been expanding into his territory, and his margins had compressed. And he had made some decisions about staffing and inventory that had not resolved the way he'd planned. This had been in the air of the family for months in the careful, indirect way that financial difficulty circulates in families that perform stability. Nobody said it directly. Everyone felt it. Marcus had had 2 glasses of wine, which is when Marcus became the version of Marcus that said things he would have edited sober. He said, no offense, Reese, but you've been doing the same thing for 3 years. Operations coordinator. When do you actually make a move? I said I was working on some things. He said, what things? Because from where I'm sitting, you're just kind of treading water. Dale said, Marcus. Marcus said, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You've got a degree. You've got 3 years of experience, but you're still in the same place. At some point, you have to ask yourself if you're actually cut out for more than this. Patricia said, we just want what's best for you, Reese. In the tone she used when she wanted the room to understand she was being kind. My mother said, nothing. She looked at her plate. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Dale. I looked at Patricia. I looked at my mother who was looking at her plate. I said, I understand. I thanked Patricia for dinner. I got my coat. I drove home in the Civic with the check engine light on. I did not go back. The next 2 years were the ones that mattered. I want to tell them to you in the way they actually happen rather than the way they sound in retrospect. Because in retrospect, things have a shape that makes them seem more inevitable than they felt from inside them. From inside them, it felt like this. Waking up early and going to a job I was good at and learning everything above my current level while doing the level I was being paid for. Reading at night. Saving 34% of my income and then 38%. And then when I got a raise in year 4, 41%. Living in the studio apartment and driving the Civic and spending money on exactly 2 categories: necessities and education. The education was not formal. It was operational. I started attending industry networking events, the kind that logistics and supply chain professionals go to that nobody outside the industry has ever heard of. I started building relationships with people who were 2 and 3 levels above me in companies similar to Meridian. I started understanding from those conversations where the value in our industry was actually concentrated and where it was not. Meridian Supply Group, where I worked, was owned by a man named Howard Fitch, who was 67 and had built the company over 25 years and had 2 adult children who had no interest in running it. He had been approached twice by consolidators in the industry and had declined both times because the offers had not reflected what he believed the company was worth, and because he was not yet ready to stop being the person whose name was on the door. I had worked for Howard for 4 years by the time I understood all of this. I had worked for him honestly and well, progressing from operations coordinator to operations manager to director of operations in that time. Not through relationship management, but through the particular efficiency of someone who genuinely understood the supply chain and could solve problems that cost the company money. Howard noticed people who saved him money. That was how he thought about value. In year 5, I asked Howard for a meeting outside the office. We had lunch. I told him I had been thinking about the company's future, and I wanted to have a direct conversation with him about it. He was the kind of man who respected directness. He said, "Go ahead." I said I knew he had been approached by consolidators and had declined. I said I understood why. I said I had a different kind of proposal, not an acquisition, but a structured equity arrangement that would allow him to monetize a portion of his ownership over time while retaining operational control for as long as he wanted it. And that would give him a succession path that kept the company's identity intact rather than folding it into a larger entity that would rename it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." I said, "A few years." He said, "Where would the capital come from?" I told him about the small investor group I had been quietly assembling over 18 months. 4 people from my industry network, all with operational backgrounds, all with capital they wanted to deploy in a sector they understood. We were not a fund. We were a group of individuals who had found each other through the networks and had aligned around a thesis about consolidation opportunities in regional logistics. Howard asked a lot of questions. We met 3 more times over 2 months. He brought in his attorney. I brought in a transaction attorney I had identified through my network. The structure we arrived at was a phased equity purchase, beginning at 22% and with options to acquire additional tranches over 5 years as Howard chose to reduce his ownership. I signed the initial documents on a Thursday morning. 22% of Meridian Supply Group. The capital came from my savings, which were not large enough on their own, and from the investor group, with me as the managing partner. I was 31. I had been building toward this specific outcome since I was 27 and had driven home in the Civic with the check engine light on. I told no one in my family. There was no one in my family I was speaking to. If you've ever built something in silence, because the people around you had already decided what you were capable of, leave a comment. Tell me what that silence felt like to maintain. And if you haven't subscribed to the family ledger yet, do it now. Because what happened over the next 3 years is the part of the story that required the most patience and delivered the most clarity. Howard reduced his ownership twice in the following 3 years. The first reduction, at year 2, brought my group to 41%. The second, at year 4, brought us to 67%. At 67%, we held the majority. Howard remained as chairman, which suited him and suited us. He knew the company and the industry relationships, and his presence was an asset. What changed was where the actual decision-making authority lived. At 67% ownership, I became CEO, not chairman. CEO. The operating role. The one where your decisions have consequences that are not theoretical. I was 33. I want to be honest about what this did and did not feel like. In the version of this story that plays well as a redemption arc, it feels like triumph. In the actual version, it felt like the first morning of a new level of responsibility that I had spent years preparing for, and was still, in some ways, not fully prepared for because nothing prepares you for the actual thing except the actual thing. I showed up Monday morning and I ran the company. I had good people around me, Howard's people, and I had the operational knowledge I had built over 9 years. What I did not have was the luxury of imposter syndrome, which I've heard described as a feeling, but which functions. When there is a company depending on you, more like a noise you cannot afford to listen to, I managed the company. It grew. We acquired a smaller regional competitor in year 1 of my tenure, which expanded our geographic footprint. Our revenue increased 23% in the first year and 18% in the second. We hired 60 additional people across both years. I still drove a sensible car. Not the Civic, which had finally been retired at 210,000 miles. A 4-year-old Volvo I had paid cash for. I lived in an apartment that was comfortable, but not dramatic. These were choices I made consciously, not from deprivation, but from the same financial discipline that had built the position I was in. I had not spoken to my family in 6 years. The first contact came from Marcus. He sent a LinkedIn message, which is the medium of choice for people who need to contact someone they have lost the right to contact casually. The message was professional in its framing. It said he had been following Meridian Supply Group's growth and was impressed by what I had built and wondered if I had time for a conversation. I read it. I did not respond immediately. I let it sit for 4 days while I thought about what I actually wanted. What I wanted was not revenge in the way that word usually means. I want to be precise about this because I think the distinction matters. Revenge implies a desire to hurt the person who hurt you. What I felt was something more specific than that. I wanted accuracy. I wanted the record corrected. I wanted to be seen clearly by people who had seen me incorrectly and drawn conclusions, and spoken those conclusions out loud at a dinner table in front of my mother, who had looked at her plate. I responded to Marcus's message. I said I was available for a brief call on Thursday at 2 p.m. if that worked. It worked. He called at 2:01, which is the punctuality of someone who wants something. He was warm in the way that people are warm when they are recalibrating toward a person they had previously dismissed. He said congratulations on everything. He had been watching the company's trajectory. He thought it was incredible what I had accomplished. He said he had been thinking about making a move, that Dale's stores had continued to struggle with the national chain competition, and that he was looking for opportunities in a growing company where he could apply his experience. He had been VP of his father's auto parts stores for 5 years. He said he thought we might be a good fit and wondered if there were any roles he should be considering. I let him finish. Then I said, Marcus, I appreciate you reaching out. I want to be straightforward with you. I remember the December dinner 7 years ago. I remember what you said. I filed it because I needed to build something before I could respond to it. And this is me responding to it. He was quiet. I said we do hire externally for leadership roles when the right candidate exists. The right candidate is someone whose experience and values align with what we're building. I don't think that's you. Not because of the dinner specifically, but because the pattern of behavior at that dinner was consistent with how you operated. And I've seen enough leadership to know that pattern doesn't usually change without significant work that I have no evidence you've done. He said, Reese, that was a long time ago. I said, I know. And the answer is still no. He said, this is really how you want to handle this. I said, I'm not handling it. I'm answering your question. You asked if there were roles you should be considering here. The answer is no. I wish you well with what comes next. I ended the call. I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I went back to the quarterly review I had been preparing before 2 p.m. Dale called 3 weeks later. Not through LinkedIn. He had gotten my direct number from somewhere, probably Marcus, and called on a Tuesday morning. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years being the one people called and was now making a call he did not know how to make from this position. He asked how I was. I said, well. He congratulated me on the company. I said, thank you. Then he said he wanted to be honest. He said the stores were in a difficult position. The national chains had taken significant market share, and he was looking at options. And he had heard that Meridian had been making acquisitions, and he wondered if there was a conversation to be had. Dale's stores. The auto parts chain. A consolidation conversation. I want to tell you that I did not enjoy this moment in a small way. I am telling you I am human, and the moment had a texture to it that I recognized and sat with briefly before responding professionally. I said, I appreciate you calling directly, Dale. I'll be honest with you too. Auto parts retail is not our acquisition target profile. We're in logistics and supply chain infrastructure, and Dale's operates in a different segment. So the answer on an acquisition conversation is no. He said he understood. He paused. Then he said, I know things have been difficult between the family and you. I regret some of what was said. I said, I believe you. I said it because I think I did believe him or believe that he believed it, which is not the same as it being sufficient, but is real enough to acknowledge. I said, Dale, I hope the stores find a path forward. I genuinely mean that. But I'm not the path forward for them. And I'm not in a position to offer the family a different kind of relationship right now. Maybe someday that changes. Right now, I have a company to run. He said he understood. We said goodbye with the careful formality of two people who had arrived at a place neither of them had planned for and were trying to leave it with what dignity remained. My mother called in October. Not for anything professional. Just a call. She said she had been thinking about things for a long time. She said she had heard from Patricia that I had spoken to Marcus and to Dale, and that the conversations had not gone the way they'd hoped. She said she wasn't calling about that. She said she wanted to tell me something she should have told me at Patricia's house 7 years ago. She said, I should have said something when Marcus talked to you that way. I sat there, and I didn't say anything, and I have thought about it ever since. I held the phone and looked out the window of my office at the parking lot below where 340 people's cars were lined up in rows. I said, Mom, why didn't you? She said, because I had believed for a long time what they believed. That you were smart but not practical. That you were building towards something that wasn't going to work. She said she had not known how to say that directly, so she had let Marcus say the version of it that she could not say herself and then looked at her plate. That was more honesty than I had expected from her, and more than the conversation with Marcus or the conversation with Dale had contained. I sat with it for a moment. I said, I know you believe that. I knew it then. She said I was wrong. I said yes. She said, I'm sorry, Reese. She said it the way my grandfather in the last script said you're right. Simple and unqualified and carrying the weight of years behind it. I did not tell her it was fine. Because it was not fine, and she had not asked me to tell her it was fine. She had said she was sorry. Those are different things, and they require different responses. I said, I hear you, Mom. I need some more time with this. But I hear you. She said, okay. She said she would be there when I was ready. We said goodbye. I set the phone on my desk. I looked at the parking lot for a while. 340 cars. 340 people who came to work every morning at a company I had built from a 22% stake in a decade of silence. None of them knew about the December dinner. None of them knew about the Civic or the check engine light or Marcus's face when he said you're always going to be the one who couldn't figure it out. The company did not care about any of that. The company cared about whether I made good decisions, whether I built good teams, whether I created a place worth coming to every morning. Those were the things I had been building toward, and those were the things I now had. The family was a separate question, one I was still working on. I promoted my director of logistics, a woman named Carla who had been with the company since Howard's time, to COO in November. I announced it at the all-hands meeting. She stood up, and the room gave her a standing ovation, and she looked startled by it, the way people look startled when they receive acknowledgement they deserved and did not expect. After the meeting, Howard found me in the hallway. He was 70 now, still chairman, still coming in 3 days a week. He had the ease of a man who had built something and watched it continue without him, and found it satisfying rather than threatening. He said, good call on Carla. I said I thought so. He said, you know what I noticed about you from early on? You never needed anyone to tell you what you were worth. You just kept building. I said I had some encouragement from an unexpected direction. He looked at me. I told him the short version. The dinner. The Civic. The decision I made on the drive home. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that dinner did more for this company than any business school could have. I laughed. The real laugh, not the managed one. He laughed too. Then he went back to his office, and I went back to mine, and we both did the work we had been doing, which was the work that had mattered all along. Here is what I know after all of it. There is a version of this story that is about revenge, and I understand why it reads that way from the outside. The family dismissed you, and now you are their boss, and they are coming to you asking for opportunities, and you are saying no. That is a satisfying shape. I understand its appeal. But from the inside, the story was never about them. The December dinner was not the reason I built what I built. It was fuel at one specific moment on one specific drive home. After that, it was just work. Years of work. The 34% savings rate and the library books and the industry events and the conversations with Howard and the patience required to build an equity position from nothing over 9 years. They were not in any of that. They did not appear in the work at all. The work was mine and the people I did it with and the company that grew because of it. When Marcus called, and when Dale called, and when my mother called, those calls were not the culmination of a plan I had been executing for 7 years. They were simply things that happened because of what I had built, the way rain happens because of conditions that have been developing in the atmosphere. I had not been waiting for those calls. I had been running a company. What I want to say to you is this. The people who dismiss you are not your business. What you build in the silence after they dismiss you is your business. Every hour you spend thinking about what they said is an hour, not spent on the thing that will make what they said irrelevant. They thought I was a poor failure. That was their limitation operating as a verdict. I chose to treat it as information about them and not information about me. And I went home, and I kept building. You do not need their approval to start. You do not need their apology to finish. You do not need them to understand what you were doing while you were doing it. The work does not require witnesses to be real. Build in silence. Let the results speak at a volume they cannot ignore. And when they finally call, you will have the clarity that comes from 9 years of not waiting for the call. You will know exactly what you want to say, and you will say it simply and without anger, and you will go back to the work that mattered before they called and will continue to matter after. That's my story. A check engine light, a dinner table, and 9 years of silence that said everything Marcus's speech never could. If this found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's being told by the wrong people what they are worth. Drop a comment. Tell me who counted you out and what you built while they weren't watching. I read every one. Subscribe to the Family Ledger. I'll see you in the next story.